Welcome back, degenerates, degeneratas, and esteemed degenerati, to the MMA RAXPOD for UFC 303, McGregor versus what? Oh, that's not it. Pereira Procházka 2, Electric Boogaloo. What a shame. Nah, not really. I mean, let's be honest. Did you really think Conor was going to fight again? It doesn't even sound like Dana White is optimistic it's going to happen this year, if at all, based on the post-press conferences in the last 2 or so weeks since they announced that the main event was going up in flames. It's funny for me because, as I've spoken before on here, I was a content producer for USA Today and the Miami Herald and a host of other publications around the U.S. for a certain amount of time for most of last year. And the last thing that I ever did for USA Today was an article focusing on the key phrase, Conor McGregor next fight. And it did get published, but I wondered how much utility it was actually going to have, given we've been talking about that fight with Michael Chandler for over a year, even longer, and it still hasn't happened yet, and the jury's still out on if it's even going to happen this year. So it's something I've had my eye on for a long time, but even as I had to churn out professional work for that fight, in the back of my head, I was really thinking McGregor has enough money at this point and is a bit too much of a loose cannon that I just don't think we're going to see him again. I would like to see him, but I just don't think it's going to happen realistically. But just like the matchmakers and just like the competitors in the ring, we adapt, we improvise, and we move on. And now we have, what some people have called an arguably deeper card. I would say the addition of Ortega Lopes probably is somewhat vindicating for that, but the subsequent fallout of the Roundtree Jamal Hill fight gradually devolving into Anthony Smith, Roman Dolidze, I think somewhat undercuts that. I also think it's a bit perplexing that Ian Garry, Michael Page, is the opener on the card and hasn't at least been bumped up to the co-main event in light of all of the rearranging that has taken place with this card. So plenty of fights to talk about. Got 11 men's fights that I'm going to go over here. 3 of them I have decided not to put out any picks on, and I won't be hedging on rounds this week, so only money lines. And I know I've said this in the past, but I am going to try to keep it rather shorter than I usually do. I'll be disappointed with myself if I go for 2 hours on this one, but I will try to keep my thoughts on all of these briefer than I usually do in the interest of gradually trying to slim down and simplify these. So before I get into a recap of UFC Saudi Arabia, just a quick reminder, please, if you haven't already, like, share, and subscribe on YouTube, and follow on Twitter if you would. Creeping up on 1.4 followers on there. I not super optimistic about hitting 2K by the end of this year, but if I were looking to add something like 500 followers a year, I think 1.5 is within striking distance at this point, and can be happy with anything that comes up over that. But if you would gradually engage on there in a following and responding capacity, I would be greatly appreciative. So thank you very much for tuning in. Only really one pick to talk about from last week because, Johnny Walker Ozdemir was a pick'em, and I understood the liability with Walker's chin, given I had just taken him as a big underdog against Ankalaev and he had been knocked out. I will say going forward, I am, even if he does move up to heavyweight, I am going to have him as one of those guys that it just kind of has nuclear chin liability to where if you're not really taking him as an underdog, you just can't feel good about taking him as a favorite or really drinking any juice whatsoever. So it's unfortunate because Walker last year was very kind. One of my best winning nights on a regular card, I believe. I don't think he fought Smith on a pay-per-view. But he was a good piece of one of my winning nights last year, and a fighter I have enjoyed capping in the past. So, unfortunate result for him. The main thing I want to talk about from last week before getting into the pay-per-view is the Pavlovich-Volkov fight. And I'm going to tell you a story about a lesson I learned 2 years ago that I should have heeded last week. As you can see, as I said, last week was, or last show was going to be my last one in Miami. I do have a new setup here now, not quite as aesthetic as my overlook over Biscayne Bay, but you know, it is, we make do with what we have for the time being. But where I am now is where I was 2 years ago, and I was at a bar watching the event that Bruno Silva fought Gerald Meerschaert at. I believe that might have been a UFC Salt Lake, if not a fight. I believe it was the night that Usman got head kicked by Leon Edwards, because I believe that happened at the Salt Lake card. And I just want to confirm that before I dive into this story. But I do vaguely remember that fight happening at Elevation, so I believe it was UFC 278. And no, that's not quite it. All right. So that was not when Meerschaert fought Silva. So bear with me, and I will tell you when that actually did happen. That was at UFC. It was Fight Night Vera versus Cruz. So I think it was a couple weeks before UFC 278. It was the opening card for that fight. That was in San Diego. So Elevation had nothing to do with that. But I was at a bar in the same area that I'm at now, that I was at watching UFC Saudi Arabia last week. And one of the big mistakes I made on that card, of which there were many, you know, I remember feeling pretty... I had the plus 4.5 on Vera Cruz, and that obviously didn't go as far as I thought it would. I had the plus 1.5 on Onama versus Landwehr, which obviously became a very infamous fight in wake of the James Krause scandal. I had Devin Clark to beat Azamat Murzakanov. I think I missed every single pick I put on that main card. I think that was one of the worst events that I had the first year that I was doing this. Did not have a lot of success that night. But the main thing that really, really hurt more than anything else that I took away from that event was that I had Gerald Meerschaert graded to beat Silva. And Meerschaert was the underdog, and I was just too concerned about Meerschaert, his age, and even though I don't think he was that much older than Silva at that point, but he had already been knocked out 4 times in his career. It had only been about 3 fights prior when or 4 fights rather, when he got knocked out by Ian Heinisch and Khamzat Chimaev in back-to-back appearances. So I was worried, you know, as he's getting into the wrong side of 30 at that point, is this a guy that is, you know, going to have reliable endurance, particularly as someone that has exclusively won in the UFC by submission? Is that going to be someone I can really count on? Now, what I pretty badly overlooked in that was that Bruno Silva at that point had a submission record of 0-5, And I decided to get cute and hedge on the under, thinking, oh, if there's a submission, it's probably going to happen in the first round, because that's typically when most submissions in mixed martial arts take place. Otherwise, I think Silva's probably going to knock him out. Instead, the fight drags out gradually into rounds 2 and 3. Silva's cardio arguably starts going off a cliff at the towards the end of the first round, and is kind of just treading water with Meerschaert, as he tends to like to do with his opponents, before Meerschaert finally inexplicably drops him. One of the few fights where Meerschaert was getting the better of the striking on his opponent and was able to get the submission. It was a pretty inexplicable performance, given Silva, in his appearance prior to fighting Meerschaert, went the distance with Alex Pereira, which nobody other than Jan Blachowicz has done during Pereira's time in the UFC. But the reason I'm bringing that up relative to UFC Saudi Arabia is because the lesson that I learned from that fight was, if you've got an underdog graded to win, just go with them. Especially if you're confident in your process long term. If you've got a, like I do at this point, a statistically significant sample that says you're going to hit on close to 50%, 1 in every 2 of your underdogs that you're picking, you're just better off going with the underdog and living with the results than trying to get cute in terms of picking a result and hedging, usually with juice. And if you end up getting that pick wrong and your underdog wins, the FOMO's not quite the right way to phrase it, because you've already missed out. And I think FOMO is more of a preemptive term in that context. But just the regret that comes with not going with the underdog when they win a pick that you had graded correctly, that you weren't confident enough in, that you tried to get cute with and hedging on the rounds and end up missing, it can be pretty devastating. And that's really what happened last week. And it bothered me to the point where I didn't even really want to think about any of this on the following Sunday, especially because I had a pretty good event, all things considered, up to that point. And to have a profitable evening ruined by a heavyweight under not hitting was pretty bad. It bothered me last week to see so many other people taking the over, just because I remain very convinced that the heavyweight division is extremely volatile, but it's volatile in the sense that you can't really discount the power on either side, to the point that expecting any heavyweight fight to go to a decision is just usually not the smart investment. Even though I recognize that if this fight did go the distance, it was going to be much more in favor of Volkov, I had absolutely no reason to expect that Pavlovich was going to even see the second round, based on the fact that it hadn't happened in the UFC yet. And it was one of the rare instances where Volkov was going to be facing a size disadvantage. And I thought Pavlovich, if he, showed the urgency that we had seen in basically all of his previous appearances, was going to be able to turn Volkov's size into a liability that he wasn't used to managing, and was going to be able to find an early finish. And that just didn't end up happening. So congratulations to everybody that hit their cute +1.5 heavyweight bet last week. I feel particularly foolish because I had Volkov graded to win. And he actually would have been my strongest underdog pick last week out of the 3 that I would have put out if I did, if I had actually rolled with him. I did have him graded more confidently than Alaskarov or Chang Ho Lee, even though Chang Ho Lee was basically more of a pick'em at that point. But had I done that with Volkov, I wouldn't have included the -1.5 in the plays that I put out, and I would have leaned more heavily in terms of a hedge on Johnny Walker and Chang Ho Lee, because they were at very similar odds. And at that point, I would have had, pairing that with Gadzi Azulev and the plus 2.5s in the Fakhretdinov Dalby and Gastelum Rodriguez fights would have come out profitable. So I was feeling I wasn't really upset about Alaskarov getting knocked out as quick as he did. I didn't think that if he entertained a standing affair with Whitaker that was going to end well for him, and that's what ended up happening. But at that point, I was already out of it, so it is what it is. But again, drawing the parallel between what happened at Fight Night San Diego 2 years ago and the Mearshart Silva fight relative to my own decision making and what I decided to do last week with Pavlovich Volkov, the lesson coming out of that is if you have an underdog graded to win, just roll with them. Don't get cute hedging on rounds when you've got an underdog graded to win. It's almost never worth it. Now, there's probably going to be exceptions. I mean, I'm sure there's times in the past where I know, like, for example, I had Neil Magny graded to beat Gilbert Burns at the start of last year, and I knew that just was not going to happen, and Burns was something like a minus 400 favorite. So if if you can tell that your process is out of alignment with the market or what have you, then at that point you can start to consider whether hedging on rounds would be the better call. In that case, I put out the plus 2.5 and it didn't end up hitting. But I didn't, I'm not sure whether that was a pick'em or plus odds or whatever, but I would have felt more confident with that going the distance than I would have with picking Magny against Burns to begin with. So, I do think there can be exceptions. I thought last week would be an exception. But there were so many other people on Volkov that I should have had more confidence in that last week, and it could have turned what ended up being a losing event into a winning one. So that is a lesson that I had already learned 2 years ago, and I didn't fall back on it. And so I'm trying to keep in mind lessons that I have previously recorded and learned for myself going into this card, and I will get into how that has affected at least one of my decisions to stay away from one of the fights on this card in a bit. But for now, that's enough lamenting the past, and we will get into breakdowns for UFC 303, and we will start with Ricky Simón and Vinicius Oliveira. Simón enters 20-5 on a 2-fight losing streak, was last seen at Fight Night Ankalaev vs. Walker 2, where he lost a unanimous decision that at least two judges saw 30-27 in favor of Mario Batista. That was in spite of the fact that Simón nearly had what probably shouldn't have and wasn't considered a knockdown in the first round on Batista. And didn't do a good job of retaining dominant position in any of the rounds, not only after that pseudo knockdown in the first, but which was definitely more of a slip on behalf of Batista, but also Batista getting slammed to open the third round. Batista bombed, if you will, and just doing a good job of getting back to his feet and getting the much better of Simón in the striking. Batista was a fighter that I really, really enjoyed taping when I first started doing this 2 years ago, and it was tough for me to pick against him. In that case, I had Simón ever so slightly out in front, and I was not pleased with myself for getting that one wrong. I also took him over Song Yadong at their Fight Night event at the end of April last year, and I made Ricky a leg in that case, and I believe I would have had a winning event had he won, but after taking the first round, I do believe there were multiple clashes of heads in that fight that didn't get acknowledged, that potentially altered the outcome and perception of that fight, even though I do think Song ended up winning. But I will, and then the only time in the 3 fights that I've seen him compete that I've picked, or that I've started doing this, that I picked against him was when he fought Jack Shore. And I took Jack Shore that night, and he was something like a 300 favorite, and definitely didn't perform anywhere close to price. That performance was a big reason I faded Shore against Joe Anderson Brito at UFC 301 this year. I'll get back to what I have mostly learned about Simón that has me concerned about him going into this fight in a moment, but just to briefly recap his opponent, Vinicius Oliveira enters 20-3 after a sensational finish in his fight with Bernardo Sopai at Fight Night Rosenstreich Eve earlier this year. Sopai was I believe, a last-moment replacement in that fight and actually performed fairly well. This was one of the live betting upsets of the year, if you'll recall, in the middle of the second round when Sopai had taken Oliveira's back. He was something like a minus 2,800 live favorite. And so if you played Oliveira to win at that point, you made a ton of money when Oliveira ended up turning the tables gradually when Sopai gassed, and then finally ended the fight in the final 20 seconds with one of the knockouts of the year, arguably, with that flying knee. Had a great performance on Contender Series last year as well against Victor Madrigal, one that I was particularly impressed by, that made me optimistic about where this guy's UFC future was going to be and wanting to see him do well. The thing that concerns me here about this matchup is that one of the big, without going too far into what all my technical criteria are, one thing that I like to do that pretty much any casual fan of this sport can do is just count the number of strikes that a fighter strings together in a combo. It's a very easy thing to do. Most fighters are able to at least string together 3 punches. You like to see 4. Some of the best can do as many as 5 or 6. And that's distance. That's not when, fighters they've got someone pressed into the fence. That's just both guys standing at range without any other obstacles around them, and what their consistent flow of striking is, whether that's, 2 punches and then a kick at the end, or just a string of haymakers. One of my favorite examples is if you watch Lucas Almeida's Contender Series fight against Daniel Zellhuber, he does like a 6-punch combo at one point where he chases Zellhuber almost entirely across the cage. It's one of the best Contender Series fights that they've ever had. I think it's one of the more underappreciated ones as well, so I would definitely recommend checking that out if you're a fan of Lucas Almeida, particularly coming off his performance against Timothy Kwamba within the last couple of weeks. I bring that up because Simón, for as much of a rep as he has as a wrestle boxer, I haven't seen him throw more than 2 punches in a combination, and that volume concerns me greatly when if he's not able to retain dominant position or find takedown success, as has been difficult for him to do in his last couple of fights. He's proven to be a fairly decent submission specialist. I believe he's had multiple arm triangles at this point, so I consider him to have fairly solid submission skills. And he does have 1 UFC knockout on his record over Rafael Asuncao, but Asuncao obviously retired, I believe, last year or very, very late in 2022 after kind of a controversial ending against Davey Grant. So it was a guy that was at the end of his career at that point when he got knocked out by Ricky Simón. And I just worry about the overall ground offense beyond submissions and the ability to retain dominant position. But I do think that given the competition that he has faced in his last couple of fights, that he is a bit better than what his performances have reflected. And the takedown rate is still high enough where I think he will be able to find a decent amount of success in this fight relative to Oliveira's takedown defense that should allow him to at least get a 29-28 if this goes the distance. Oliveira, it's important to remember, like, for all the spectacle that that finish against Sopai was, he was at one point his opponent was a 2,800 favorite because the fight was just that out of his favor, and he had been that easily put on the ground halfway through the fight. I think Simón's got a better gas tank, obviously, than what Sopai has. I do think, and this is something that you've got to keep in mind, is that when you see that kind of, a guy that's averaging over 5 takedowns per 15 minutes, a lot of times that can be a reflection of the fact that they're having to do a lot of mat returns as opposed to taking their opponents down and then keeping them on the ground. So that was definitely the case for Simón against Batista. But I'm not super confident in the get-up game from Oliveira, even though he was able to turn the tables around on Sopai. I think that was more of a reflection of the fact that Sopai gassed after taking this fight on short notice. This is a guy that has headlined UFC events before, or at least one UFC event before, and has fought a much sterner and higher level of competition. It's crazy to look back and see that Simón has these wins over both Merab Dvalishvili and Montel Jackson now, given where both of those fighters have since evolved to in their careers. And the other thing that I think is important to keep in mind too is that Oliveira is already someone that has been knocked out multiple times, 3 times in fact, during his MMA career prior to getting to the UFC. So there is a bit of attrition here that I think makes him as concerned as you would be for Simón, given Simón's own knockout that he suffered at the hands of both Uriah Faber and then last year against Song Yadong. I think that there's a bit more equal suffrage, if you will, in terms of the attrition that than maybe Oliveira bettors are wanting to admit this week. So I am going to be taking Simón. I think that he's got better upside for a submission here, as well as if this fight does go the distance. Oliveira's only gone the distance twice in his MMA career, and Simón has done so 12 times, and that doesn't even include the performance against Merab that technically ended up being a submission at the end of that fight. So he's someone that I think has demonstrated much better cardio. I think he'll be glad that this is 3 rounds instead of 5, as was the case in his fight with Song Yadong. And even though I would expect Oliveira to have the advantage on the feet here, I think that Simón recognizes that he's kind of in a back against the wall spot relative to the trajectory of his career, and that he needs to fight smart and to his strengths in order to win this. So I think Ricky Simón wins a 29-28 decision, where he ends up conceding one of the rounds just because there was a bit too much time spent on the feet, but largely wrestles his way to a decision here where he's able to control Oliveira, if not on the ground, then at least keeping him clinched up against the fence, and then largely dictating the pace of the fight that way. So I don't love his price tag, but I do think there are enough variables in his favor here to justify him in the 200 range. So give me Ricky Simón to win. The next fight is Ray Tsuruya and Carlos Hernandez. Tsuruya is undefeated at 9-0, 22 years old, fresh off of winning the Road to UFC Season 2 in February earlier this year. Conversely, Hernandez also in his last performance fought a Japanese fighter in the form of Tetsuro Taira, and suffered the first knockout of his MMA career at the hands of the young rising prospect. The line on this is totally, I don't want to say totally out of whack, because I would feel comfortable playing Tsuruya probably at 400 here. In the 400 range, which he's still at some books, but not the one I use, the book of the world, if you will. Hernandez, is at this point, he's 3-2 in his UFC career, and 2 of his wins have been split decisions. Even though I enjoyed playing him as an underdog against Denise Bondar, it's that win hasn't really aged gracefully. Just given Bondar once again lost, I believe, as a favorite, or at least under pick'em circumstances, against Ronaldo Rodriguez at UFC Mexico earlier this year. And it certainly doesn't bode well for him that he's coming off of the first knockout suffered against a guy that had largely been known as a submission threat in his last performance. Getting out to 500, I think, is just at least a little bit disrespectful to Hernandez here, because, he is going to have, at least on a numbers basis, a little bit more volume on the feet, and he does have much more experience going the distance than what Tsuruya offers. Tsuruya only, his first decision he ever saw was in the Road to UFC semifinal back in August of last year. So, and you can argue he's faced a sterner level of competition along those same lines as well. But, I mean, look, this is an obvious setup spot for a Road to UFC winner to perform well and kind of put himself on the map and announce his arrival in the flyweight division during International Fight Week. He's got the advantage here in terms of age. He's only 22 years old relative to Hernandez's 30, even though you wouldn't say Hernandez is anywhere close to the downswing of his career at that age. The advantage in takedowns is very stark. I mean, across the 3 fights that we've seen from Tsuruya, he's averaging nearly 7 takedowns per 15 minutes, and at a far more efficient clip than what Hernandez has been able to land in his own right in the UFC. Hernandez is pretty, fairly acceptable takedown defense, but hasn't been anywhere close to the level of elite that you would expect him to be stuffing all of the attempts from a guy that's landed nearly 7 across the per 15 minutes in 3 of his Road to UFC appearances. He did manage to finish 2 of those, or Tsuruya rather, finished 2 of those appearances, and hasn't been finished himself yet, whereas Hernandez is coming off the worst loss, you could argue, of his MMA career due to being knocked out. And the other thing is, too, this is one of the rare instances where this is a UFC-level fighter that has not actually won by knockout in their MMA career relative to Carlos Hernandez. So the threat of power coming back on Tsuruya just isn't there. So I think that there's a slight possibility that if Hernandez's takedown defense is able to hold up and he's able to keep this a standing affair, that he's able to get the better of Tsuruya relative to offensive striking volume and possibly win his 3rd split decision of his UFC career. But I'm not super optimistic, and that's definitely not what the UFC, based on this matchmaking, has in mind for this International Fight Week spot. So, yeah, not much more to say about this one. I would just stay away if it's in the 500 range on Tsuruya, but anything lower than that, I understand why you would feel like you want to play this, and I think that he certainly should win this and get to 10-0 here. So I'm not saying Tsuruya is on the same level of Tatsuro Taira relative to undefeated Japanese flyweight prospects. He's 2 years younger, and there's certainly a lot of time left to tell. I will say Tsuruya probably is the most impressive export from the previous or from the latest season of Road to UFC. And the UFC is, as they try to, in the same way that they are continuing to want to elevate the stock of their Contender Series show. You would reason that they're trying to do the same thing with Road to UFC. You watch the Road to UFC winner here, they get you interested in watching the subsequent Road to UFC tournaments in the future. So, give me Tsuruya to win. I'll say that he gets a decision win here, that he doesn't end up finishing Hernandez, because Hernandez, outside of the last fight, has shown fairly decent durability, and his only finishes, the only times he's been finished in this case are when he got submitted by an absurdly large flyweight in Alan Nascimento, and who was also super slick submission expert, and Tatsuro Taira, who obviously is one of the best overall prospects for his age that the UFC has. So give me Ray Tsuruya to win, but not necessarily outright impress. But it does appear that flyweight now has 2 undefeated Japanese prospects to keep an eye out on in the UFC. The next fight is Martin Buday and Andrei Arlovski. Buday last fought at the final UFC event of 2023 at UFC 296, losing what I believe was the opening fight of the card to Shamil Gaziev in what was a horrific performance from Buday. Very puzzling also, given his previous UFC appearances. There was a bit of a discouraging performance he had against Lukas Brzeski back at what was actually an event I talked about earlier on this show, UFC San Diego in 2022. Split decision that he quite arguably could have lost. But the Gaziev performance was rather bizarre, just for the fact that Buday had success going the distance previously. Gaziev had pretty open cardio concerns, and Buday, just for whatever reason, threw absolutely nothing at Gaziev in the first round, and got hurt early, and just basically never really made a credible attempt to put himself back in the fight. It was a really big letdown performance overall. At what was close to a pick'em, I believe, but Buday was the slight favorite in that, and I did make him a leg on, I think, most of my plays for that night, and it was pretty devastating to see him go down in the fashion that he did, especially because I remained very, very unconvinced that Gaziev was legit, which is why I totally stayed off of his main event with Rosenstrike, despite having a very favorable grade on him, and that was proven to be quite vindicated. Conversely, Arlovski was last seen about a month after that fight at Fight Night Ankalaev Walker 2, where he lost a unanimous decision to Walter Cortez Acosta in a fight. Cortez Acosta was favored anywhere between like 500 and minus 700 to win. That was an obvious stay away for me in that case. And it looked, at least through the first 10 minutes, to be the right decision, because that was a fight that Cortez Acosta clearly did not take seriously. He spent the second round largely showboating and trying to show up Arlovski, which Arlovski did not appreciate. And the judges ended up giving, I think, I'm not sure if it was in unanimous fashion, but I think at least a couple of the judges gave Arlovski the second round of that fight due to the inactivity and just, the choice to salsa dance that Cortez Acosta made. Him not taking that super seriously was one of the reasons that I actually picked Rebellis to Spain to beat Cortez Acosta earlier this year. Although, but I don't think anybody really expected Cortez Acosta to wrestle, just because that was something he hadn't even shown any close to any interest in since his Contender Series appearance. So it is what it is in that case. But getting back to the matchup, again, I say it's never a good idea to take a heavyweight over, but I could see why a lot of people in this case think Buday is just going to kind of lazily glide his way to a decision here, especially given so many of Arlovski's recent appearances have gone to decisions. He hasn't won a fight by any method other than decision going back to 2015 against Travis Brown, which is actually the last time that he got a first-round knockout or a knockout, period. If he doesn't win this fight by knockout, Arlovski will have gone 25 straight UFC appearances without a finish. A record that I would be sincerely shocked if it ever gets broken. But, in terms of kind of lessening that sample and looking back to more recent performances, this is still a guy who has gone the distance in 7 of his fights since 2020, of which there have been, I think, 10 or 11. So kind of a outlier in terms of what is typically happening here at heavyweight. And certainly given the fact that Arlovski has suffered as much attrition as he has in his career, been knocked out 12 times, submitted 3 times. 2 of those 3 finishes have come in his last 3 appearances. You simply just can't rule out here that there's the possibility that Buday is able to get the better of Arlovski, particularly after he was able to find a submission on Josh Parisian within his last 2 appearances. I do think that there is a bit of front runnership for Buday here based on his performance against Gaziev. Definitely wasn't thrilled with the stalling out in terms of the volume. Wasn't good at all to see him just kind of covering up instead of trying to, mix things up and potentially shoot takedowns, especially given how bad of a gas tank Gaziev had and that he was, visibly getting tired even to open the second round, and Buday just made absolutely no attempt to capitalize on that because he had, I guess, suffered enough damage at that point that he was just kind of checked out. But I don't expect Arlovski, who again hasn't won a fight by knockout since 2015, to be able to damage him up front the way that Gaziev did. So I think that the longer this fight goes, the worse it probably looks for Arlovski. I think that he's probably going to have to empty the tank to the best of his ability if he wants to get a win here. Otherwise, I would expect Buday to get at least a 29-28 here, possibly something where he kind of spends the first round getting his reads as he sort of did against Jay Collier before really turning up the volume over the last 10 minutes and, having a better gas tank than I think, the perception of his frame would perhaps give off. Buday, I think, is more skilled than he really does get credit for. The commentary team loves talking about how they think he might be one of the strongest heavyweights in the UFC. I think the jury might be out on that, but the guy is still just an absolute unit of a human being. And between being 13 years younger than Arlovski here, who comes into this fight at age 45 in what could more than likely be his final fight in the UFC, given this is International Fight Week, it wouldn't be entirely astounding if this is the retirement match for Andrei Arlovski, regardless of what the outcome is. And also Buday not having been finished until his last performance, the first of his MMA career, compared to the 14 or 15 finishes that Arlovski has suffered himself. I would think here that Buday is justifiably priced within the 200 range. I hope that he stays there. His price has come down a little bit, I think, from when I did put him out. He's sitting at like minus 240 right now, and I'll feel good about playing that given It's not very often that with this kind of matchmaking that you see this kind of a discrepancy relative to both age and attrition, where you're getting this kind of a price tag. I'll be a little bit nervous the longer it goes. I would like to see Buday get a finish playing him at this price. But, recent history says Arlovski is probably going to survive going the distance, but barring some kind of robbery like what happened in the Collier fight, I don't expect Buday to make it as close, and I don't expect him to suffer the same kind of attrition that he did in the Gaziv fight, or even against Brzezinski, given those were much younger fighters that were more capable of kind of getting out front and hurting Buday on the front end, and getting ahead in the striking. I don't expect Arlovski to have that same level of success for 15 minutes, even though I don't think it's out of the question that he could possibly steal the first round by having a little bit more effective damage. So give me Buday. I hate saying a fight is going to go the distance, but I'll say that Buday wins a 29-28 decision that nobody really enjoys watching. The next fight is Payton Talbott and Yanis Ghemmouri. Talbott's 8-0, had a super impressive performance against Cameron Simón at UFC Fight Night, Rebus versus Namajunas, a fight that I had graded like razor close, had like half a point in favor of Talbott, and decided it was just too slim for me given my history of betting against Cameron Simón, that I decided to go with the plus 2.5 rounds, especially given Talbott did not have a single first round finish in his MMA career to that point. Very nearly could have gotten one against Simón, and ended up finding one within the first 30 seconds of the second round, in what was an extremely impressive performance. Conversely, Yanis Ghemmouri enters 12-2, suffered the first knockout of his career in his last fight against William Gomis at UFC France in September of 2023. The interesting note coming out of that fight was that Ghemmouri threw 24 strikes at Gomis's head and did not land a single one. So I think that has to make you very concerned with Ghemmouri's ability to land strikes at distance, although Gomis is a bit of a physical abnormality at bantamweight, which is why I've been very favorable in terms of picking him in a lot of the fights that he had even before that one. I did pick him over Francis Marshall, and I did have him over Jean Silva before he got sick or botched his weight cut or what have you and had to pull out of that one. Again, I don't have much to say about this because the line is like comical, totally out of whack, and just not really worth betting on at this point. It's quite funny. He opened as like minus 298 at DraftKings, and if you did jump on that, if you're not like me and want to wait or more willing to pounce on lines as they come out as opposed to waiting until weigh-ins to lock in your bets, then, kudos to you for pouncing on that one, because that was obviously going to be the play here. I don't think Ghemmouri has a single advantage in this fight beyond experience going the distance. Talbott has him totally covered in terms of offensive and defensive striking. We haven't seen Ghemmouri. He didn't attempt a single takedown, I don't think, in his fight against Gomis. And, we have no reason to believe that he would be the one to break Talbott's takedown defense of 90%. Ghemmouri has a 4-1 submission record, but hasn't won by submission since 2020. And has only fought 5 times total since then. It's again, in the same way that Ray Tsuruya has a showcase spot, this is another showcase spot during International Fight Week for an undefeated prospect that the UFC has very high hopes for. Local guy in Vegas, so he's somebody that's very favored and around the company a lot. And, he's got a very, very bright future in a very crowded division. But definitely, I don't think has as much attention from casual MMA fans yet as maybe some people would like. And I think that they want to give him, this feels like a drop down in competition from what the Cameron Simón fight was, given how he passed that test with flying colors. So it would be. I saw somebody earlier this week say that there's pretty decent numbers on him on Talbott for finding a second or third round finish relative to plus odds. So I think that'd be a good play to consider here if you're a prop better of that consideration. But I learned my lesson in terms of hedging on rounds with the danger that this guy Talbott presents and taking the plus 2.5 against Simón. And Ghemmouri coming off a knockout loss, even though it was a body kick and the first one he suffered in his MMA career, just doesn't make me optimistic about trying to risk that again. I think there's better spots on this card. And, you just can't bet Talbott as a money line at this point, just given the irresponsibility of the price. So I'll say Talbott wins by second round knockout. It wouldn't surprise me if it's something like a body kick again, given that Ghemmouri's kind of already shown vulnerability to that, and Talbott has really, just an all-level striker, has proven himself to be exceptionally dangerous and only evolving his skill set at this point. So I'm sure the UFC would like to see Talbott get his first round finish of his MMA career in this fight. I'm not totally confident it happens, but I understand why the line has blossomed out to what it is, given this does feel like a step down in competition. I would feel comfortable playing Talbott out to like 500, but anything lower than that is just totally insane. So give me Talbott to win by second round knockout, and that's really all I have to say about this. The next fight is Charles Jourdain and Jean Silva. Jourdain enters 15-7-1. Last lost a split decision that probably would have been a unanimous loss if that fight hadn't happened at Canada in UFC 297. That was a fight in which I picked the plus 2.5, given I can't remember who I had graded to win that one, but I was worried about how Jourdain, if he wasn't able to get the fight to the ground and didn't, relative opposite Woodson's really solid takedown defense and the length that he offered, how he was going to handle striking with him for 15 minutes. And I was correct in terms of, what happened there. It's funny, I'm remembering now, there was a brief moment where Jourdain thought that he won after Bruce Buffer read the decision. And I remember watching that fight on mute because I was at Hard Rock Sportsbook, and we had the fights on my phone, the woman I was watching with at the bar, and we were both kind of confused when they read the result. We were like, wait, who actually won this? So that's funny looking back on that. But at least my read was right for that, not like it was for the Brad Katona and Garrett Armfield fight, unfortunately. Conversely, Jean Silva enters 12-2, won his Contender Series appearance last year, and then at Ankalaev Walker 2 earlier this year, got to face Weston Wilson, and a win that has aged surprisingly well as the year has gone on, and did knock out Wilson towards the end of the first round. I believe I took the under in that fight, given how many of Wilson's appearances concluded in the first round, and the threat that Silva offered as a knockout artist and a very wide favorite in that one. Probably should have gone on the under for Wilson's follow-up appearance, but we live and learn and move on. But Jourdain is another fighter that when I started doing this, I really enjoyed taping, and offers a bit more offensively than I think he's gotten to show in his appearances since I started taping him. I picked him as an underdog against Lando Venata and was grateful that even though that one it didn't seem to start great for him, he was able to eventually grind out a guillotine win there. Picked him as an underdog against Burgos, and even though he had a great third round, I was pretty disappointed that Burgos was just able to backpack him and pick up a majority decision that way. Really, really did not enjoy, and it was interesting that the UFC let Burgos go after that performance, even though I was just disappointed because Burgos in his recent fights had not really shown any interest in takedowns, and I thought that if this fight is a pure standing affair for 15 minutes, Jourdain's going to get the better of him on the feet. He did get the better of Burgos on the feet in that third round, but because Burgos was able to take him down and ride him out on the backpack with a back triangle for a lot of the first 10 minutes, Burgos was able to get the win there. I rode with Jourdain against Nathaniel Wood, and he got pretty thoroughly outclassed in that one. That was a pretty disappointing performance for Jourdain. I can't recall if he was the favorite in that one or not, but I do believe that he was because I think I did make him a leg for that UFC Paris event 2 years ago. But that gave us a great price on him against Kron Gracie, and that was a big ring rust fade for me relative to Gracie, and I made Jourdain a leg at UFC 288, and that was a pay-per-view where I almost got a clean sweep outside of my first pick missing by about 50 seconds, which was the under on Ribeiro's fight with I'm forgetting the name of him now. But it was whoever Ribeiro beat at UFC 288. All right, I'll look it up. Forgive me, I don't like interrupting the flow of the show to do this often, but this is going to drive me crazy. Joseph Holmes, Ugly Joe with the curly mustache. That was brutal. Anyway, made Jourdain a leg again against Ricardo Ramos at Fight Night Fiziev Gamro last year, and we did profit from that event, and partially due to that. Jourdain, I don't think, was a terribly large favorite in that matchup, but another one where he kind of got taken down by Ramos early, but was able to grind out a guillotine and end up winning in the first round. It was a very similar fight to his performance against Lando Venata. And then just, being worried about the physical abnormality that Sean Woodson is at featherweight, decided to hedge with the plus 2.5, especially given how many of Jourdain's recent performances had gone to decision or gone over the 2.5 rounds. He's actually only had 3 of his 13, I believe, UFC appearances that have ended inside the first 12.5 minutes. So he really, plus 2.5 rounds has been a pretty good bet for Jourdain, which you would, somewhat expect given the guy's never been knocked out and he's only been submitted once, and that was from Julian Erosa in a fight that did go over the 2.5 rounds mark. So he's proven to be pretty durable, but I do think that his, for as lauded as Jourdain's cardio gets, especially in, people that are picking him to beat John Silva in this matchup, that it is a little bit overblown. He does not have a very good record in fights that have gone the distance. His only 2 wins by decision in the UFC have been Andre Ewell and Kron Gracie. And Gracie, again, was someone that only had 2 previous UFC appearances and hadn't fought in multiple years at the time that fight happened. And Andre Ewell was an okay win at the time, but obviously he's since fallen out of the UFC, and that win since has not necessarily aged super gracefully. Here's the list of opponents that Jourdain has gone the distance with and lost to. Sean Woodson, which again you can understand, although I still don't think that one should have necessarily been a split. Shane Burgos, which is, understandable. Nathaniel Wood, which is okay, hasn't necessarily aged super gracefully since it happened. But then also Drew against Josh Kulabau, lost a split decision with Andrei Fili, which is I don't want to say is aged gracefully, but for that being his third UFC appearance, you could somewhat forgive him. But he did lose his UFC debut by unanimous decision to Desmond Green, and also lost his first fight ever that went the distance in his MMA career to TJ Laramie, who washed out of the UFC pretty quickly. That was the fight with him and Jourdain in that case was back in 2017, although it was a 5-round affair for a championship in TKO, if you're familiar with that promotion, which is the promotion that Jourdain spent all but one of his MMA career fights before moving into the UFC. So make of that what you will. So he doesn't have a super impressive record going the distance. The only 2 fights he's ever won by unanimous decision were Andre Ewell and Kron Gracie. A lot of split decisions, a draw in one case, and a sprinkling of unanimous decision losses, and one majority decision loss to Shane Burgos that could have been unanimous, that I had higher hopes for him in that case. Now Silva's got, not even half as many trips going the distance, and he hasn't necessarily been super impressive either. He went the distance on Contender Series, and that was a 29-28, so he didn't necessarily, I think on an earlier season of Contender Series he wouldn't have earned a contract, but because Dana White's kind of gotten to the point that they're giving him out like candy, and as long as you don't put up a total stinker and are at least somewhat exciting on the feet, you're usually going to end up getting one, especially because they get so much of their card filler now from Contender Series replacements anyway. You can you see why he ended up getting the call in that case last year. But his 2 decisions prior to that Contender Series appearance, he lost by split in his 3rd ever MMA fight, and then lost a unanimous decision after that. And those have both been the fights. Those are the only 2 losses of his MMA career. So there's definitely concern here relative to Silva's experience and success going the distance, even though he's kind of more rounded out his skills in recent years, or perhaps even somewhat improved his cardio based on his Contender Series appearance. But outside of that Contender Series appearance, 8 of his last 9 fights have ended in the first round, which under most circumstances would kind of make him a front runner, but he's the underdog in this fight. I'll be curious to see how this plays out if it does go beyond the first 10 minutes, just because I don't necessarily think either of these guys have proven to be very effective fighters when it does go the distance. And Jourdain does have the rep of having this great cardio, even though we've seen him fade in select fights. Again, he had the great 3rd round against Shane Burgos, even though he ended up losing that. But he did really have nothing for Nathaniel Wood throughout that entire fight, and lost to Sean Woodson by split, even though it probably should have been a unanimous decision loss. And Julian Erosa, the one time he got finished in that fight, it was in the 3rd round. So it's more of a case-by-case basis with Jourdain in terms of how his performance throughout a fight overall holds up. Whereas Silva, at least his most recent trip to a decision, ended up being a unanimous fashion win. Although off the top of my head, I can't recall if he won the 3rd round of that fight, if it was 1-1 going into the 3rd, or if he made enough of an impression in the first 2 rounds to where he just kind of coasted to the end of that one. But if he had just kind of taken the 3rd round off, I can't imagine he would have been looked as favorably upon to get a contract under those circumstances. The striking numbers here are largely dead even. In terms of measurables, Jourdain's 2 inches taller, but the reach is the same at 69 inches. Neither of these guys have hit their 30s yet, so age isn't really a liability. I think what's going to make the difference here is that Silva's shown a much better ability to get to the ground on his terms than what Jourdain has. Both of Jourdain's wins by submission in the UFC have been guillotine attempts in which he had kind of already been put on the ground by his opponents. So even though he's got a very slick jiu-jitsu game, Silva's someone that hasn't been submitted yet, and is somebody that is his own 2 submission wins in his career have both been by guillotine. So you have to imagine he has at least some sort of ability to be hip to that if he does go to take Jourdain down, and Jourdain at least attempts at least 1 or 2 of those. And I wouldn't necessarily be super concerned with Jourdain threatening submission attempts off of his back at that point, given we've only seen him win by guillotine. I think Silva's probably both of these guys have good power. Jourdain, his knockout against Doo Ho Choi, even though it was almost 5 years ago at this point, was still very impressive with respect to that, even though we haven't really seen him flash that similar kind of knockdown power against any of his other opponents since then. Jean Silva, obviously, we know the guy hits like a truck and is pretty menacing. Some people have likened his gaze to that of a serial killer, and we know that the guy hits pretty hard. So I would think Silva's got the more evident power, but both of these guys have a respectable enough threat to where I'll say it's pretty even, and the striking numbers reflect that they're pretty even as well. But again, Jourdain is averaging less than 1/10 of a takedown per 15 minutes, and that few amount of takedowns he's been able to land in his UFC career have only come at a clip of 10%, and his takedown defense isn't even at 50%. So he's not good at all at getting the fight to the ground on his terms when he wants it to, even though he's got good ability on the ground that he's demonstrated. And there's opponents that have had decent success putting him down there when they've tried to, although they've had to be more savvy of the guillotine threat in that case. So even though I think Jourdain has the more dynamic finishing upside here, just because he's got a more credible guillotine threat, given we've seen it in the UFC, I am going to take Jean Silva to win. I think that this fight is probably going to end up going the distance, but I would expect Silva to make more of an impression with his power and with ground and pound and being able to put the fight on the floor on his terms. I would expect him to get a 29-28 here, possibly win the first 10 minutes, and then Jourdain, has a decent third round in which Silva's, struggling to get the fight down to the ground again at that point. But I think Silva's coming in here more confident, just slightly less attrition, and with more effective demonstrated takedown ability than what we've seen from Jourdain at this point. So give me Jean Silva as my first underdog pick on this card. The next fight is Andrei Fili and Cub Swanson. Fili enters 23-11 after suffering a vicious knockout to Dan Ige at Fight Night Hermanson Pyfer earlier this year. A card in which I made Ige one of my main parlay legs and felt very, very good about that result given the attrition Fili had suffered to that point. Cub Swanson, conversely, has not fought since Fight Night Luque dos Anjos last year. I believe I advocated to stay away from his fight with Hakeem Dawodu. I believe Dawodu was a pretty healthy favorite, and if memory serves, Cub Swanson's body language when the decision was being read reflected that of a fighter that thought he had lost and figured they were going to announce Dawodu as the winner. And then they announced Swanson as the unanimous decision winner, to the shock of a lot of people, including Swanson himself. So I think that kind of speaks to why he's such a healthy underdog here. Looking back on that fight, I thought it was closer than the post-fight reaction of some people were making it, but I would have at least expected it to be a split. The fact that it went to Dawodu in unanimous fashion I thought was fairly shocking, and I did feel bad for Dawodu given that was a fight that he kind of needed to recapture momentum in his career after having one of the worst showings of his career against Julian Erosa in a fight in which I faded him in favor of Erosa as an underdog, and we haven't seen Dawodu since. Had Swanson lost that, his most recent win would have been a first-round knockout over Darren Elkins in 2021. He's only fought 2 times in the last 2 years, getting leg kicked to death by Jonathan Martinez in October of 2022 before the somewhat outrageous Dawodu decision last year. I have this one graded very, very slim. It's shocking to me that Fili is as wide a favorite as he is, given the attrition that he has suffered in recent years. The Brito fight, I think some people kind of thought that Fili had a rep for being chinny even prior to the Brito performance. But that was the first time he had suffered a first-round knockout in his MMA career, and then he suffered another one against Dan Ige that was like, he got put out pretty bad. Even though Fili has demonstrated himself to have fairly decent power as recently as the knockout win over Lucas Almeida at the end of 2023, which I think was part of the reason he felt encouraged to take the fight with Dan Ige, which happened less than 2 months after that performance against Almeida. Swanson's obviously carrying, his own share of attrition. Got knocked out in the first 90 seconds against Giga Chikadze only a little over 3 years ago. But obviously Swanson's bigger concern in his MMA career has been the losses by submission, of which I don't think there's much of a threat here. Fili hasn't had a submission win since 2012 before he got into the UFC, and is only averaging, I think, 0.3 submission attempts per 15 minutes. So I don't think that that's something you necessarily have to be concerned with going into this one. Now, given the lack of a submission threat from either side, and given how many performances throughout their UFC careers have gone to decision, I came into this thinking that I was going to want to take a plus 2.5, especially given that it is sitting at basically a pick'em, or it was at the beginning of this week. However, as I said, in terms of reflecting on the lessons I've learned from the times I've taken the juice and been wrong, of which I affectionately refer to in my spreadsheet of data analysis as red flags, one of the earliest, in fact, one of the first 10 that I ever recorded was when I took the plus 2.5 on Andre Fili's fight with Joe Anderson Brito, in a fight where I had the same amount of confidence in Fili to beat Brito as I do here for Fili to beat Swanson, which is why I don't feel good playing him at a price tag that's sitting around minus 265 at this point, despite the fact that Fili's got size advantages and presumably a wrestling advantage, even though he's not going to, I don't think, necessarily threaten Swanson with submissions on the ground. Swanson has demonstrated one-punch knockout power in his career before, although that was, going as far back as 2012 now, to when he knocked out Charles Oliveira back when Duke Bronx was still at featherweight. But two of his last 3 wins have been by knockout, and against fairly decent level fighters. I don't think very highly of Daniel Pineda, but Darren Elkins is someone that I've taken as an underdog as recently as last year, and was able, anytime you're able to get a first round knockout over the Damage, who's kind of known for just being the bleediest bleeder that ever bled and surviving into the later rounds of fights. I mean, even Nate Landwehr couldn't finish the Damage, despite how much of a bloodbath that fight became. So Swanson, they say the last thing to go is the power, they colloquially, and I think it's kind of more of a case by case basis than making that generalization, but I think Swanson still has the ability to, just because he's demonstrated it earlier in his career, I think he's still got that potential for hurting someone with one punch in a way that could jeopardize Fili, particularly coming off of the bad knockout that he had against Ige and having suffered first-round knockouts in 2 of his last 5 fights. I think it's fair to wonder as Fili starts, he's going to be... it's funny, he... I believe he turned 35 today. As I'm recording this, June 25th, this will be out tomorrow, June 26th, but I believe he's actually turning 35 today, which, oh no, I'm sorry. He turned 34 today? He was born in 1990. It's going to be too hard for me to figure that one out, but, he's still going to have an age gap advantage here, but I think there's enough of a threat here. Anyway, happy birthday to Andrei Fili. I still think as he's getting into the back half of his 30s, that combined with the attrition makes it enough to where, and the other factor I'll say is that Fili, he's demonstrated he'll drop guard when he fights, which I don't think is going to serve him very well against someone like Swanson, who probably wants to keep this standing for 15 minutes. If Fili's going to wrestle for the majority of this fight, I think that he's probably going to be in pretty good shape. But he needed to do that largely against Nathaniel Wood and didn't do that as consistently as I think would have permitted him getting. I was disappointed he didn't at least get something close to a split decision in that fight, but he did make it 1-1 going into the third, and a lot of that was him leaning on his wrestling, which I don't think he used as much later in the fight as he could have. That would have made it a little bit closer. So I did, but that fight also was in the UK. If that fight was happening in the US, or at least a more neutral location than that, I wonder if he would have gotten more favorable judging than he received against Nathaniel Wood in that case. Regardless, this is a stay away for me. I've gone on longer about this fight than I originally wanted to. I can understand you wanting to play fight goes the distance. I just think that given it really just comes down to how much power Swanson has left in the tank. And even at 40 years old, I think it's still credible enough early on that given Fili's recent performances and chin, that you should probably just stay away from it. So no pick for me on this one. I do slightly lean Fili, although kind of depending on if he's, creeping into his 35 today, as I've just noticed his birthday, I might slightly lean Swanson just because I'd give him a point back in terms of the age gap being 5 years versus 6. But the play I would really want to make for this is the plus 2.5 rounds. But just given what I've been burned by that when Fili's been the favorite before, I'm just not going to do it. So stay away. The next fight is Pyfer and Marc-Andre Barriault. Did I butcher both of those? Of course I did. Joe Pyfer enters 12-3, coming off his main event debut against Jack Hermansson. Lost that in February. That was pretty devastating for me because I would have had a winning night if Pyfer had just been able to win one more of those rounds against Hermansson. He was a pretty healthy favorite in that one, but Hermansson, the Joker, did manage to get the better of him over the last 15 minutes, kind of survived everything Pyfer threw at him over the first 10 before really turning up the volume and weaponizing cardio against him in what was Pyfer's first time seeing a third round since his second MMA fight. Only the second time Pyfer's ever had to go the distance in his MMA career, and Hermansson very acutely weaponized that against him to win a much-needed unanimous decision for the sake of Hermansson's own career momentum. So It was a great performance from Hermanson. One that I'm sure Pyfer probably took away a few things to learn from and kind of figure out about himself. And I hope that he applies going into this one. Marc-Andre Barriault fought last time. He enters 16-7 after his last performance at UFC 297, in which he lost a split decision to Chris Curtis. I don't necessarily remember what the general consensus was coming out of that one, but it does feel like to me that was another fight in which the fact that he was a Canadian fighting in Canada perhaps gave him a little bit more favorable judging than he perhaps deserved given his performance. I do believe I took Curtis as the favorite in that one. I might have hedged on rounds. I don't necessarily recall. I mean, I can look back right now and figure it out pretty quickly. Yeah, I took Chris Curtis just as the favorite. So I didn't hedge on rounds in that one, even though I, thought if Curtis wins, it's probably going to be going the distance because he's been known to just kind of give away the first round and then be more of a builder. Barriault's shown pretty good ability to put volume together, but despite the fact that his nickname is the Power Bar, hasn't necessarily shown the greatest cardio in his MMA career. So that, I think, makes this matchup a bit more intriguing with Pyfer than the widening odds would imply in this case. Pyfer's going to have age going for him here. He's going to come into this 7 years younger. I think he does have the more well-rounded MMA game in terms of demonstrating an ability to get the fight to the ground on his terms. And, we've only seen Barriault win by submission once in his entire MMA career, and that was against Jourdain Wright a couple of years ago. I believe I picked Wright to win that one just because I thought he was going to be better on the front end. But Barriault was able to get the better of him, and I believe that was shortly after his move to Killcliff FC. And this was someone who, didn't necessarily impress across his first 3 UFC appearances that all went the distance, then got popped for PEDs. So I wasn't optimistic about the career trajectory for Barriault given that recent context, but from 2022, he has managed to put together a 3-3 record. Since I started doing this, he's actually 3-2 because I didn't grade any events until 2 weeks after his first round knockout loss to Chidi Njokuani, which remains the only time he's been knocked out in his MMA career. But that still shows a potential to get knocked out early and not a good tolerance for damage that I think Pyfer might be able to take advantage of here. So even though I think Barriault's going to have him covered on volume, I don't expect him to finish Pyfer here in a way because again, we've seen Pyfer get submitted by guillotine before he got to the UFC, and the only win by knockout that Pyfer had was, him getting his shoulder separated after getting slammed by Dustin Stoltzfus. So we haven't actually seen him get, chinned in the way that we saw Njokuani do to Barriault only a couple of years ago. So I think that's probably what most people are expecting happens here. I'll say that Pyfer does do it in the second round. I think that even if this does go the distance, that based on Pyfer's performance against Hermanson, he's able to make enough of an impression in the first 10 minutes that even if he does kind of gas out and Barriault still has the volume going in the third round, that this still ends up being a 29-28. In fact, I would feel more confident that that's probably the way this is going to go, but I still think Pyfer does enough damage and lands the more effective strikes in the opening 10 minutes that he's able to make enough of an impression to get a 29-28 here. Although I think that the knockout upside is certainly all the way in his favor, and certainly the submission upside as well. Just given he's had, I think, a more impressive and more consistent showing, or not consistent, but is just averaging far more submission attempts per 15 minutes than what Barriault has put out during his own UFC career. So I understand why the line has gotten wider over the week. I don't really feel comfortable playing Pyfer out to the 300 range given his most recent performance. And if Barriault, if he doesn't end up getting hurt in the early rounds, you wonder if the volume's going to make enough of an impression here for him to spring the upset. But I am still going to go with Pyfer here. If he doesn't drop back down into the 200 range, I probably won't make him a main parlay leg this week. I still think that he should end up getting the win 29-28. And I think it's important, too, to consider this is another guy that if not the UFC, then at least Dana White has invested a lot of, quite literally invested heavily in between, putting up Pyfer's rent when he was homeless so that he would have an opportunity to focus on his MMA career. This is a guy who the boss has heavily invested into his story and that the UFC wants to see do well and potentially turn him into a star, which is, I think, one of the main reasons why he is fighting on International Fight Week after making his main event debut. So give me Pyfer to win by decision. I won't be surprised if he finds a finish in the first 2 rounds. But I'll say that Barriault survives and even steals the 3rd round, but Pyfer still makes enough of an impression to win a 29-28. The next fight is Ian Machado Garry and Michael Venom Page. Garry's 14-0, won a split decision that really was not that close over Jeff Neal at UFC 298. All the Garry haters want to tell you that Neal should have won the first 2 rounds with more effective striking, but Neal's volume just was not there. And I mean, it's not like he dropped Garry at any point as much as just kind of, hit him hard back into the fence or whatever. Garry got a 30-27, I think, from the other 2 judges, and the judge that scored a 29-28, Neal, kind of got roasted for that scorecard. By the people that don't have the bias against Garry. All the people that love to cuck shame and whatever are going to, be all over him and are definitely pulling for Michael Venom Page in this one. But, Garry is someone that I enjoyed taping very early on in his career, and I've picked him in pretty much every fight that he's put on. I think I stayed away from him when he fought Daniel Rodriguez, and I took the under in his fight with Song Kanan and was devastated that he didn't just, stay knocked down and knocked out after Kanan, kind of showed him to be a little bit chinny in that performance. But picked him against Darian Weeks, picked him against Gabe Green. I think I took the plus 2.5 when he fought Neil Magny, although I didn't invest super heavily into that just because I was worried about Magny's ability to survive. Made him a leg outright as like a pretty healthy, I think like 200, 230 favorite against Jeff Neal at my clean sweep at UFC 298. Michael Venom Page, obviously a longtime Bellator star, finally made the jump over to the UFC this year at the ripe age of 37. And I believe I think it might have been a pick'em when he fought Kevin Holland, but it was pretty close. He might have been a slight underdog, but had a pretty impressive overall performance and was able to get a 29-28 over a dangerous guy in Kevin Holland. I don't know how many fighters could make their UFC debut against a guy like Holland and, impress in the way that they did. Although obviously there's, your litany of fight IQ concerns that Page has demonstrated despite his ability between the Hanslow karate Stephen Thompson-esque fighting style that he's able to make work for himself, but has still suffered some damage by doing in the past, on top of the jawing antics that you know there's going to be a couple of those humorous exchanges in terms of Garry and Page talking to each other during this fight. So it'll be interesting to see what the two of them have to say to each other when the gloves finally drop and the action starts. But I feel pretty good about Garry in this spot. I'm somebody that loves playing the age gaps here, and even though it doesn't necessarily always pan out, great example of where the decade-wide age gap fell short earlier this year was when Cesar Almeida fought Dylan Budka. So it's not a 100% hit rate, but the success for the younger fighter when there's a decade or wider age gap is pretty pronounced in a historical context, which is one of the reasons I feel good about Buday against Arlovski, as I talked about earlier. So, younger fighters, they're consistently making improvements. Garry's still only 26, which is pretty crazy for, the high-level experience he's been able to put together over the last year and a half. And Page is at the point where even though the drop-off hasn't arrived at 37 years old, you have to think that it's coming, and when it does, it's probably going to come pretty fast, which is why I think the UFC is putting him in this spot, and why if Leon Edwards beats Bilal Muhammad and Michael Page does beat Ian Garry, I think you can make a very reasonable case for Page to just get a title shot right away, because that's a fight, Edwards versus Page, that the UFC would love to make in another London pay-per-view main event, to just kind of milk the most out of not only Edwards' title run relative to the UK audience, but then also get a pretty good ROI for bringing Michael Page over from Bellator before he kind of goes off into the sunset. So I think from a promotional standpoint, the UFC's in a good position either way here. If Garry wins, he's going to be 15-0. And I think probably, needs to get that fight with Colby Covington, and then is probably going to be due for a title shot at welterweight after that. And, an Ireland-UK matchup, which is what this is, but featuring Edwards and Garry would be pretty fun to see. Garry has faced hard hitters in the past in the form of both Song Kanan and Jeff Neal. He's faced a pretty large reach disadvantage in the past in the form of Neil Magny, but he hasn't had to face both of them together yet. And we know Page is a very dangerous, powerful sniper that I think is going to be able to hurt Garry early, but Garry has shown a few things that I think will serve him well in this fight. He's really an excellent clinch fighter and has done well. It's one of the reasons I think he was able to get a 30-27 over Jeff Neal. Has shown a really good ability that despite the fact that his reach is pretty short for a guy of his size, he's still got very long legs and has gone out of his way to make the most of them. He landed all 43 of his leg kick attempts against Neil Magny, and obviously really devastated his legs to the point where he had Magny knocked down several times in that fight, to where I think one, if not multiple judges scored that a 30-24. So he gave Garry a 10-8 in all three of those rounds, which is not something you see very often. And to do that like a guy who's got the rep of being a gatekeeper that Neil Magny does, I think is more impressive than he perhaps gets credit for. So I would expect low leg kicks to serve him very well in this fight. That's one of the big things that set up Michael Page's only knockout loss previously to Douglas Lima in Bellator. But I don't necessarily expect Garry to knock out Page here. Page only has one more fight going the distance in his career than Garry does, although Gary's proven to be a bit more of a consistent final round performer than Page. The bigger key though here, I think, is that Garry is a guy who even very early on in his MMA career said that the greatest asset and weapon that he has in his arsenal is his cardio. And he is a guy that builds and tends to do much better as the fight goes on. if he's able to get out of trouble in the first as he did against Song Kanan. He is a guy that has demonstrated the ability to turn it up as the fight goes. And the best round that he had against Jeff Neal was the last round, which I believe was the round that the judge that scored the fight in favor of Neal gave to him in that 29-28. So I would expect if Page isn't able to get Garry out in the first round, I think that Garry is going to, even if he concedes the first round to Page in 10-9 fashion, I would expect Garry to make the reads, whether it's just keeping the fight on the fence in the clinch or finally using his wrestling again in a way that he hasn't really had to do outside of he didn't even need to do it against Neil Magny, but he still landed multiple takedowns in that fight. And he used it a lot in his last fight before he came into the UFC when he won the Cage Warriors title against Jack Grant. And I would like to see him use it again in this fight because I think it'll show how much more well-rounded he is than just having the rep as this, dangly striker that doesn't necessarily have a great reach, but is just kind of a cage skirter and, occasionally a guy that gets into the clinch. But again, great clinch fighter, one of the rare guys that you'll see utilize standing knees in the clinch, which I think are a really effective weapon for him. I wouldn't be surprised to see him use them here. Page is a guy that has had to just make his living on athleticism, and even though he remains a great athlete and demonstrated as much against Kevin Holland in his most recent performance, you just have to wonder, given the discrepancy in age here, even if the fall-off doesn't come in this fight, when is it coming for Page? And against a guy who is so openly willing to take the fight into deep waters and gradually keep building in the way that Garry is, how is he going to respond to that at age 37? So I think Gary's going to win a 29-28 decision here. I wouldn't be surprised if he's able to get the better of Page's chin. I won't necessarily be surprised if Page does finish him in the first, but if this does go the distance and it's not in a situation where Page has knocked him down in multiple rounds and Gary's been able to survive on his back or what have you, I would be very shocked if Page earns a decision over Garry in this case. So give me Ian Garry to win by unanimous decision. The next fight is Anthony Smith and Roman Dolidze. The fight that was originally supposed to be Jamal Hill and Khalil Roundtree has since devolved into this grotesque matchup. Dolidze's last performance was in February as he moves back up to light heavyweight. He lost a main event to Nasruddin Imavov in a majority decision that probably should have been unanimous. A loss that hasn't aged poorly in any sense, especially given Imavov's somewhat not really a comeback, but pretty impressive despite the controversial stoppage win over Jared Cannonier. Arguably got the better of Marvin Vettori in the first round of his fight prior to that. But, didn't have the cardio that Vettori did and ended up losing a decision in that case. But prior to that had three of the more crazier finishes that very few people had a better 2022 than Roman Dolidze. I remember taking the plus 2.5 in his fight with Kyle Dawkins, despite the Dawkins chin concerns, given Dolidze's 3 prior appearances had all gone to decisions. And Dawkins, I think suffered a clash of heads in that one that didn't bode well for, or no, I don't think he did. I think he had already been hurt, and then they kind of came together on an exchange. But then Dolidze really did end up getting the better of him. And then the Phil Hawes matchup, I think Hawes was doing fairly well until the fight hit the ground, and then Dolidze totally dismantled his leg. And at that point, even though he didn't tap, it was evident his knee had been screwed up pretty badly from the leg lock. and Dolidze was able to finish him in pretty short order afterwards. The Jack Hermansson fight, I think a lot of people were expecting Hermansson to kind of give Dolidze a vet lesson and quell the hype, and then Dolidze put Hermansson in, I mean, one of the more spectacular calf slicers that you're ever going to see. And again, even though Hermansson didn't tap, had him in a tied up enough position where he couldn't really respond with anything and was able to just kind of finish him on the ground there. So even though Dolidze doesn't have a UFC submission win, he has utilized submissions in both of his most recent appearances to set up knockout finishes, and is one of the exceptions that I make in terms of my technical analysis relative to ability. You know, I would generally say a guy that doesn't have a UFC submission win is more unproven in that department. But this guy is clearly demonstrated based on those two performances, particularly what he did to Hermansson, that he's got pretty high-level submission ability. And it helps that he hasn't been finished either by knockout or submission yet. Conversely, Anthony Smith pulled off one of the betting upsets of the year over Vitor Petrino in his most recent appearance, but otherwise enters with an insane record at 35 years old of 38-19, coming into what I believe is his 23rd UFC appearance. And the guy has been finished 15 times. And the only other fighter on the roster that has suffered anywhere near close that much attrition is Andrei Arlovski, who is 10 years older than Smith. I think a lot of people that are picking Smith this week, you know, they're saying he's the more comfortable fighter at light heavyweight. That may or may not be true. Again, Dolidze is a guy that has won at light heavyweight in the UFC before, albeit it was a split decision over John Allen, and I believe his UFC debut was also at light heavyweight, in which he earned a first-round knockout. But you know, decided it would be better for his career to drop down to middleweight to a mixed run of success. The level up in competition at that weight class hasn't necessarily served him well. But I think there's a lot of things about Smith that are being forgiven in the context of this kind of being thrown together on short notice. Dolidze moving up back to light heavyweight, even though it's really just him not having to deal with a weight cut to make it into this class. Dolidze's never been finished, and Smith has been finished 15 times. I don't know how you can look at that and say that the finishing equity goes to anybody but Dolidze, both in terms of a knockout or a submission here, even though I believe the win over Petrino was the first time Smith's ever won by guillotine in his MMA career. And I think when you pair that with the arm triangles he's already won by previously in his career, as well as his previously established threat of a rear naked choke, he's demonstrated an excellent submission repertoire in his own right. Arguably a more impressive skill set there than what he's, you know, shown of late on the feet. I still hate that he got the win over Ryan Spann in their rematch. I don't think that he deserved to win that fight at all. Almost all of the success that he had on that fight was low leg kicks. I think of like the 50 significant strikes he landed, like 35 of them were just low leg kicks. I don't think that he deserved to beat Ryan Spann in the rematch at all, but I'm very biased because I picked Spann to win that fight in that case. But had he not gotten the split there, he would have a record of 1-4 over his last 5, and the one win in that case would be him getting the enormous upset over Vitor Petrino. Neither of these fighters have been very impressive going the distance in their careers, which is why I think it's so interesting that the narrative for the people picking Smith this week is that, oh, he's so tough, and if Dolidze isn't able to get him out of there, you know, what's going to happen? Smith is not Marvin Vettori. Like, he's not going to be able to build going late into the fight in the way that, Vettori has in a lot of his performances, the Cannonier fight notwithstanding. But if you look at the record for both of these guys, I mean, in terms of their final round success, like Dolidze, it's not great. I have him at around like 40% in terms of his 5 appearances. But here's the list of wins by decision that Anthony Smith has in his own UFC career. Leonardo Ghemmouri's in 2016 in what was his UFC re-debut after making 1 appearance on UFC on Fuel TV, getting submitted by Antonio Neto before going to Bellator. And then after that decision win in 2016, he didn't win by decision again until the Ryan Spann rematch last year, a fight that I think he probably should have lost by decision. So the guy's durability going the distance is being heavily overstated here. He's more of a guy that needs to submit you in the first round, or he's not going to take cumulative damage well as the fight goes on. And Dolidze's never been finished. Like, Imavov just finished Cannonier, but he couldn't put away Dolidze. And Dolidze hang tough into the later stages of that fight. The way it was a majority decision, I think, was because he made the 4th or 5th round somewhat ambiguous. And the Marvin Vettori fight, he faded, but there were people that made a case that he thought he should have won that fight based on damage over the first 10 minutes. So I think that given this is a 3-round fight, I don't necessarily expect Dolidze to be a world beater for all 15 minutes, but given the fact that Smith only has 2 decision wins in the UFC and has only gone the distance 7 times across his, he's got at this point 57 career MMA appearances. I mean, he's demonstrated to be much more of a guy, especially given all the wars that he's been in, main event affairs, going back to more of the middle of his UFC career. The best days for Smith are behind him at this point. He needs to be fighting guys that are not as live finishing threats, or at least have the gap in their skill set relative to submissions that he's able to exploit. Ryan Spann is a guy that will entertain rolling with you on the ground and has gotten bitten for it more times than not. It's how he lost the first fight with Anthony Smith. It's how he lost to Nikita Krylov. Vitor Petrino had never really been tested by an opponent of Smith's level, and I don't think the UFC made that matchup, particularly with that fight happening in Brazil, having Smith in mind to win, and he was just kind of able to exploit Petrino's protection of his neck and get the guillotine, which was the first one Smith had ever gotten in his in his MMA career, I believe. I'm not sure how he won his second fight ever against Jeremy Shepard in 2008, but you can interpret that how you will. I won't be surprised if this goes the distance, but I totally understand why Dolidze is the favorite here, and I think it is... Yeah, I think too many longtime fans are wishfully wanting to believe in the Smith of old based on what just happened in the Petrino fight. And I think that there's too much bias baked into his price tag here, despite the fact that he's the underdog. I think with full camps under normal circumstances that this line would be a little bit wider. So I do think that Dolidze is going to win. I'll say that these guys survive to a very sloppy decision and that Dolidze gets a 29-28. I don't think he's going to gas necessarily, but maybe he makes enough of, Smith makes enough of a late impression just from hanging around that he's able to kind of win the third round on volume. But I very much expect Dolidze to land the more impactful strikes in the first round and for that to carry over into the second round. And that if this fight does go to the mat, I don't think Smith is going to get the better of Dolidze down there, given the submission acumen that Dolidze has shown in setting up his previous wins by finish. I don't expect him to finish Smith down there. If he does finish Smith, I expect it to be more of a knockout on the feet. But I think that the finishing upside here has to heavily favor Dolidze, given the difference in attrition and the fact that he's never been finished himself. And if this fight does go the distance, I think people are very much overvaluing Anthony Smith's own ability to be effective in fights that go the full 15 or 25 minutes in other circumstances. Whereas Dolidze, I think, deserves a lot of the rep that Smith is getting relative to being a guy that's tough in his own right and doesn't necessarily go away. These aren't two cardio mavens, but they are both guys that are tough in their own right. The difference is one of them has been finished 15 times and the other guy hasn't. So I think that's enough to justify playing Dolidze as a favorite here, and I'm going to be picking him to win. I won't say that he finishes Smith, but I won't be surprised if it happens at all. I'll say that he gets a 29-28 decision, though. The co-main event of UFC 303 is Diego Lopes and Brian Ortega. Lopes enters after a statement win over Sodiq Yusuff at UFC 300, in which he knocked out Yusuff in the first 90 seconds. I played Yusuff as the underdog in that one, in a fight that I called one of the most recent cases of two-way bias on any line in recent memory, which kind of ended up being not the most graceful prediction that I have had. But again, I didn't necessarily feel super bad about it given Yusuff was the underdog. I would have felt worse about that if I had picked the favorite to win while saying that and then the favorite had lost. You don't see many not only turnarounds but rises like Lopes has had in this sport. It's been pretty miraculous to watch. Again, you have to consider that a little over a year ago, this was a fighter that lost on Contender Series and had compiled a 2-1 record outside of the UFC since then, and only got back into the UFC as a short notice replacement and in a fight that he lost, and 3 fights later is now in the co-main event of an International Fight Week pay-per-view. There's just not a lot of fighters that pull off something like that. But given 3 straight first-round finishes, you could say Lopes has definitely earned his way into this spot. Conversely, Ortega won against Yair Rodriguez in their rematch at UFC Mexico, Moreno versus Royval 2 back in February. Ortega's win over Yair cost me a massive winning night in a card that I should have leaned more heavily on the over on rounds in the Moreno-Royval main event as opposed to believing Yair would win the second fight against Ortega, particularly when I picked Ortega to win their first fight. After putting in a considerable amount of tape study time on both Ortega and Yair. And I spoke back during my preview for Fight Night Mexico, which I did as a one-off, given I said I was only going to be doing pay-per-views but wanted to take my victory lap after the clean sweep at UFC 298. I spoke at length about how that UFC Long Island card, the first time Ortega and Yair fought, was one of the worst events that I've had while doing this, and how it was just, getting to the end of the night, watching the main event, hoping, okay, I've had a pretty bad night overall, but, hopefully my last pick here for Ortega as the favorite will come through. and then Ortega loses via injury in the way that he did, and I just remember throwing back my head and laughing like it's just one of those days where almost everything goes wrong. So Ortega's been, I don't want to say a bit of a boogeyman for me for the 2 fights that he's capped here, but these are 2 fighters that I haven't necessarily had a whole lot of success with. Although I did in the first 2 fights that Lopes has had, in terms of, I took the over for his fight with Evloev, although that was mostly based on the fact that people have joked that Movsar Evloev can't finish a can of beer. And I, mainly expected that one to go the distance. And then I also, given Gavin Tucker's enormous layoff in Lopez's first fight after that, I figured Lopes was going to get the better of him in that case, and he did there as well. But I faded Lopes against Pat Sabatini, and that ended up being a big blunder. And I faded him against Sadiq Youssef, and that ended up being the wrong read too. So 2 guys I haven't capped with the greatest accuracy in both of their recent appearances. And I think part of that is that the striking numbers for Lopes don't necessarily reflect the improvements that he's made. I think that a large part of it is reflected by the first 3 rounds in each of his first 2 appearances, which were against Joanderson Brito and Movsar Evloev in 2 fights that he lost. And since then, the guy has not even had a full round of cage time. Beat Gavin Tucker in 1:38, beat Pat Sabatini in 90 seconds, and the Sadiq Youssef fight lasted almost the exact same amount of time. So you don't necessarily see, when there's that small of a sample across those last 3 fights, that making much of a shift in terms of the average, when so much more of it is rooted in the Contender Series and returning UFC debut that this guy had, which is why he's still conceding nearly a strike and a half more in terms of absorbed versus landed on his lifetime UFC career numbers. And we haven't seen Lopes win by like 1-punch knockout yet, but it was perfectly evident from the Youssef fight. I was more willing to believe that the guy's power that people were talking about coming out of the Sabatini fight was more of a product of Sabatini not really having a great chin, which is, taken advantage of by fighters like Damon Jackson. But the Youssef fight, I think, was pretty big statement win for him, where he demonstrated he's got pretty decent power, even though I still wouldn't quite go to the length of saying he's got 1-punch lights out power, just because we haven't seen it across any of his other appearances. And it's important to remember too that this is a guy in Lopes that has been knocked out twice previously in his career, but in both cases they were 2nd round knockout losses. Whereas Ortega has only ever been taken out of a fight by doctor stoppage, as it was against Max Holloway, and then knocked out in the Rodriguez fight, technically, even though that was more of an injury caused by submission. So I think that in terms of attrition, there's probably more of an advantage to Ortega here than the numbers reflect, and I think that there's a lot of forgiveness that people are willing to do for Lopes in the grand scheme of his MMA career, given the recent rise that he's had, but I think that will eventually come back to bite him in some respects. I think that Ortega's got much more impressive experience here, and it's important to remember that this is the list of fighters that Brian Ortega has lost to. Max Holloway, Alex Volkanovski, and Yair Rodriguez. All 3 of those guys have been UFC champions. In the case of Rodriguez, it was more of a freak injury that explained why Ortega lost, and Ortega did get his revenge on him in their rematch, so he did avenge at least one of those losses. Ortega has won all of his other MMA appearances. Now, I think it's fair to point out that there's a lot of people that would say there was a run very early in his career where he lost. He was losing a lot of his fights until he wasn't, and was able to kind of come back and get third round finishes over people that if he didn't necessarily pull out, he might have lost if those fights had hit the scorecards. So I think that that's a fair thing to consider, and I believe the only win outside of the Frankie Edgar fight that he had by first round finish was overturned to a no contest. That was his UFC debut. So there's certainly context that's important to apply to Ortega's career as well. But there was so much of what he showed against Yair Rodriguez that I thought was going to show up in the fight that they had the first time they fought. Ortega not only, showed the excellent submission game, but there was a lot of really, really solid ground and pound and retaining of dominant position that showed up against Rodriguez that I thought was going to be more evident the first time that they fought. Does a really good job blending elbows and hammer fists that I don't think he necessarily gets a lot of credit for relative to his ground striking in terms of how lauded his submission and jiu-jitsu game is. He's an all-around very, very complete fighter on the ground. And so if he is able to get this fight to the ground, which I think Lopes will be more than willing to entertain, I think you have to wonder about how much of his high-level experience is going to pay off relative to the threats that Lopes is going to be more than willing to illustrate down there. I mean, he was very, very conciliatory to letting Evloev put that fight on the ground and was able to fight very effectively from his back in threatening submission attempts. But Evloev ultimately still won that fight because he was hip to everything. And Ortega is a guy that is lauded as one of the best jiu-jitsu practitioners in MMA that we have, period. And I have to imagine that he's going to be hip to everything that Lopes is going to throw from him off his back in the same way that Evloev was, and perhaps even more so to the point that he wouldn't necessarily let himself get caught in a limb bar attempt, if you will, the way that Evloev was at the end of that fight that potentially allowed Lopes to get one of the, or I believe the closing round of their fight. So I do think that Lopes is going to have the advantage on the feet here, which isn't necessarily illustrated by the numbers, although Ortega is a guy that, based on his own striking numbers in his UFC career, is absorbing more strikes than he lands. But I think that the later this fight goes, the more the experience is going to pay off for Ortega. And the only guys that have been able to finish him, both were injury circumstances, although one of them was a doctor's stoppage, but it was at the hands of Max Holloway, who's one of the best fighters we've ever seen in the sport, period. Are you going to put Diego Lopes in the same tier as Max Holloway and Alexander Volkanovski? You could probably... I would be curious if, he is as much of a threat as Rodriguez is, but again, Rodriguez really got that win off of kind of a fluke injury the first time they fought, and it kind of got proven to be a fluke in the rematch. So taking away that injury stoppage, are you really going to say that Lopes's ascension has gotten him to the point where he can take out a guy that is proven to largely be durable and grind enough to eke out very gritty victories? It was so crazy that Ortega rolled his ankle in the pre-fight introductions against Rodriguez in the rematch. As somebody that picked Yair, I was quietly ecstatic. I thought, oh, this is Yair has this served up on a platter for him, and then arguably went out and got a 10-8 first round. based on the fact that he was able to drop Ortega and nearly got him into a finishing position. It was stupid for him to try to chase a submission on the ground after that, but he had Ortega in a very bad spot. But Ortega settled in, kind of calmed down a bit after he admittedly was spooked himself by rolling his ankle, and was able to eke out the victory. The guy is a grinder, and if he doesn't go away early, I think that he's probably going to turn the tables on the early burst from Lopes in a way that surprises a lot of people that have been super high on this guy. I mean, Lopes is the definition of a front runner based on his 3 most recent performances, whether you like it or not, that have now made him the favorite in this. So I'm going to be taking Brian Ortega as the underdog here. I won't be surprised if it's a 29-28 finish, but it wouldn't surprise me either if he gives Lopes the first submission loss of his MMA career in the late stages of this fight. I think it's going to be a 29-28. I do think that Lopes has much more of the knockout upside in this fight, but I think that I think these guys are much more even on the ground than people want to admit, and that, you know, it's probably even greater of a. It might even. I just think that there's still too much hype on Lopes, which is, you know, I can be criticized for that given the way that I evaluated the Lopes Yusuf fight and even the Lopes Sabatini fight, but I can see I disrespected Ortega too much in evaluating his last fight to where you're really going to have to show me something for me to pick against that guy again. And I just remain unconvinced that Lopes is of the champion caliber that has taken down Ortega in the past in the way that Volkanovski and Holloway did. So, I mean, if Lopes wins this fight, I mean, the guy is suddenly a serious threat at featherweight. But I don't expect him to knock out Ortega. And I think that even if Lopes wins the first round of this fight, that we're going to see a similar to performance to what Ortega showed against Yair, where he settles in and puts the fight more appropriately back on his terms in the follow-up rounds and is able to get a 29-28 decision. So give me Brian Ortega based on the higher level experience. And now we come to the main event. Alex Pereira and Jiří Procházka 2. Again, I said at the top of this show that I was going to try to keep it short, and I've gone pretty lengthy on a lot of these breakdowns outside of the stayaways. So I'm going to try to keep this main event breakdown pretty brief because I already broke it down once last November and was correct in my prediction. And my prediction has not changed going into this fight. And I don't think that we saw a lot of anything that would make me think otherwise in the time since that these guys have fought, as well as in the first fight that they had. So I'll try to do this as quickly as I can. Pereira enters 10-2, got the win over Jamal Hill at UFC 300, a fight that I picked him to win in. Since losing out on, since taking Sean Strickland to beat him at UFC 276, I've had pretty good reads on all of Pereira's fights. I took the 4.5 under in his first fight with Adesanya at plus odds. That, got a bit bailed out in the final 30 seconds, but proved to be correct. I took Adesanya in the rematch in an event I attended at UFC 287. That Adesanya did win by KO. I believe I also took the over on rounds in that case, expecting Adesanya to kind of lean on a decision. So got that one wrong. I took Jan Blachowicz to beat Pereira. I thought that Jan won that fight. I thought that the split decision was a gift from the UFC because they were trying to get the most out of this high-profile signing that they had. And it seems very obvious based on the fact that they're giving Adesanya a title shot off of a loss, that if Adesanya wins and Pereira is still champion, they're trying to remake that trilogy. I don't buy into this Pereira Yuri trilogy hype, the way that all these Procházka truthers are seemingly trying to will into existence this week if Procházka wins. The trilogy the UFC wants is Izzy versus Pereira, which I think would be their 5th fight overall in combat sports. That is the sequence of rematches that they are really striving for. And I think that if Pereira regains if Izzy regains his middleweight title, that they're going to try to match Izzy at light heavyweight with Pereira in the champion matchup in pretty short order while they still can. Procházka conversely, and then I picked at Pereira to beat Procházka at UFC 295, and I also picked Pereira to beat Hill at UFC 300. I made him a parlay leg in both of those cases and was rewarded in both. Yuri, conversely, I believe I took the over. It was a +1.5 when he fought Glover the first time, and that cashed with pretty considerable ease. Since then I faded him against Pereira, and I faded him against Rakic. He lost the first round against Rakic in unanimous fashion, but kept the pressure on him, didn't really go away, and ended up getting a comeback win at UFC 300 in that case. It bothered me that he won that fight just because so many of the people that pick Yuri do it on the basis that, oh, the guy has heart and whatever, and are willing to overlook the fact that the guy's defense has kind of consistently been pretty bad, which I think is one of the main reasons why Pereira was able to come back and beat him in their first fight. And I don't expect a guy like Pereira, who has to be coming into this fight with even more confidence than what he had against Procházka the first time, despite the fact that he's taken this on short notice, and despite the fact that he allegedly has a broken toe coming into this, which is very funny given the reason McGregor allegedly pulled out of this main event originally. The difference in confidence here, I think, relative to the first fight is the biggest shift in terms of evaluating how things have changed, because I don't think much has changed. But it's less about where Pereira is with his own confidence than Yuri. Yuri came into the fight against Pereira on a 14-fight winning streak. He had not lost since 2015. He beat Rakic, but lost the first round in unanimous fashion against him, and no longer has a claim to the title in the same way that he did when he fought Pereira in November of last year. So I think that the difference in confidence here is highly significant, and I don't think that Pereira has really suffered much more attrition since then, in the same way that Procházka clearly did in the early stages of the Rakic fight before he was able to just kind of hang tough. And I insist this is a big red flag when, fighters or bettors are taking fighters because, oh, he has that dog in him. And, that's a reason to be a fan of a guy, and that's fine. But you don't bet a guy just based on the fact that he shows heart. There have been a ton of fights this year where guys that have just kind of hung around on the basis of heart end up vindicating or getting results that I think in a long-term capacity don't really end up playing well in their favor. I think a very recent good example of that was Brady Heistand's fight against Garrett Armfield, where it's like, oh, he had the dog in him, so he won. Okay, whatever. If you're following a capper that is consistently putting out those kind of colloquialisms and buzzword phrases as reasons to be laying your money on those picks, I would exercise extreme caution there. And that's coming from someone who is a professed casual still with this sport, despite the fact that I've pretty much have not missed an event since March of 2022. I try to put a bit more reasoning behind all of my picks than just saying, oh, this guy's going to win because he got that dog in him. I don't question that Jiří has great heart, but I do question Yuri's defense. I think it's very interesting that he kind of gave an interesting answer this week in which he said that, Pereira is employing black magic or whatever in order to, have this championship run that he's been on. I think that's pretty disrespectful. And if there were, can you imagine if like Anthony Smith or Jan Blachowicz or some other white light heavyweight that doesn't have the same kind of swooning over him that Procházka does had said something that outrageous about a Brazilian fighter like Pereira, how that would be interpreted as racist, and the not downfall, but negative criticism that would come onto them. Procházka is like one of the only I think white light fighters that could get away with saying something like that. And if that's really what he's grasping at, which is kind of surprising given how much humility and grace he showed in what some people considered a controversial stoppage in their first fight, for him to say that this week after being pretty conciliatory to the fact that he was hurt at the end of the fight at UFC 295 is bizarre to me. Pereira is just too lethal. The sequence against Jamal Hill, I think, doesn't get enough credit for how spectacular it was, just because 2 fights before that, Holloway-Gaethje happened, which was one of the greatest endings to any fight that we've ever seen in MMA. I mean, for Pereira to get kicked in the nuts like that and not even break gaze while holding off Herb Dean, like, I don't need you to step in here, and then with the like very next strike just land that patented left on Hill that ends up knocking out Hill for like the first, like, he's the first guy to chin Hill. Like, Hill's got 2 knockout losses on his record, but the Paul Craig one was really more of a product of him getting arm barred and then having it totally broken and just not tapping. He was the first guy to really get the better of Hill on the feet. It was super impressive, and I think only served to raise his confidence. And I think Procházka is a very interesting fight to me because, again, Hill is a guy that I think has shown much better defensive discipline than Procházka has. And, I just don't see any reason to why Procházka's defensive lapses, and he's just a little bit too awkward for his own good. Rakic was taking advantage of it until he was no longer able to, and I don't see why Pereira wouldn't be able to do the same thing here. Jiří, I think, has a path to winning if he consistently deploys his wrestling, because that's how he was able to get the first round against Pereira. But Pereira is going to have too much of a window over the course of 5 rounds to hurt Jiří with something, as he's consistently been able to in almost all of his appearances in the UFC against nearly all of his opponents. So I think Yuri's going to need to follow much more of a Blachowicz-style game plan if he wants to win this. I don't expect him to fight smart, because he just hasn't really done that in any of his appearances. And he just hasn't gotten the better of guys on the feet convincingly the way that Pereira has. The fight that Jiří had with Teixeira was so much closer on the feet than I think anybody expected, and Jiří was on his way to losing that fight on the scorecards before he just kind of inexplicably got the better of Glover in the final minute on the ground and submitted him. Obviously, Yuri's the more well-rounded guy here by MMA standards, but I think that the guy is just too much of a wild ass for his own good, and Pereira is going to be able to capitalize on that much in the same way that he did in the first fight. I think this is going to be another second-round knockout for Pereira. I don't think Yuri's going to go away in the first, even if he gets hurt early, because he's shown the heart and the resiliency to kind of battle through the initial wave of pain, if you will. but I think that Pereira is just going to be eventually too much for him, and that Yuri's not going to have this fight in his greatest potential realm of success for as long as he needs to, in order to get back his title and win the rematch here. So I'm taking Alex Pereira to win. I'll say it happens by second round knockout. I will be a little bit more nervous the longer this goes, but again, based on the way this first one played out and Procházka's most recent performance against Rakic, I don't really see any reason why this wouldn't play out any differently than the first fight. And that's going to do it for the RAXPOD for UFC 303. Thank you very much for tuning in. Once again, please like, share, and subscribe on YouTube and Twitter if you haven't already. And we'll enjoy a nice break next week from doing any capping period before we are back for UFC 304, which features a rematch between Leon Edwards and Belal Muhammad. Lots of interesting fights on that one. Kind of unfortunate that the card after this, as I'm recording this today, just had it announced that the main event between Rose Namajunas and Macy Barber has been canceled due to a Barber pullout. That's 3 events in a row in which the main event has been canceled, so it's pretty rough sledding for the UFC right now. But I think that London card has a lot to look forward to, and I think the card in London after that, whenever it ends up happening, is potentially a very hype one, pending the outcome of the Ian Garry and MVP fight. But until then, thank you very much for tuning in, and I look forward to coming back here, same time, about a month later, to break down the next pay-per-view for all of you. And if you've hung through this long, thank you very much, and hope you'll stick around for the near and future beyond. Take care, folks.